Well, welcome everyone. It's good to see you. Thank you for coming out tonight. Let's maybe just start by setting some intention. Maybe I can just help set some intention. Thinking about, not just for this talk, but really thinking about, community education at Kimberton Waldorf School. We really are trying to create situations where people can come together and share their thinking, share things that they've read, and really be on a journey together to be addressing some of the big questions that we're all facing. We're all facing a lot of really big and important questions as parents, as educators, and just people in the world today. We're living at a time of really unprecedented challenges, and there's a lot of stressors in the world, and there's a lot of complexity, and there's a lot to try to figure out. So how can we do that other than try to do it together? Because ultimately, it's sort of up to us, right? We're in this place where we're facing a lot as a species, we're facing a lot as a community, and we've got to try to figure it out for ourselves and for our kids. In 2022, the Financial Times chose the word polycrisis as the word of the year. And in that same year, Collins Dictionary chose the word permacrisis as the word of the year, just to give you a sense of sort of the scale and the scope of the kinds of problems that we feel like we're facing. And there's another word that's sort of out there that I actually come across a lot, which is thought of as the metacrisis, right? It's the sense that we are facing many really big scale civilizational challenges right now, global challenges right now. But something that the word metacrisis evokes is that it's not just challenges out there in the world. There's actually something meta about the situation that we're in. We are participants in this situation. There's something like a psychological or spiritual, emotional crisis that's sort of interacting with all of these crises out there when we think about the climate, when we think about the economy, when we think about technology and social media, when we think about geopolitical instability, right? We have plenty of problems, plenty of crises, but ultimately the sense of acknowledging that we're all participating in something like a metacrisis, it gives us some language and some conceptual frames to really think about how we're all involved in this and how we have to sort of go meta and go within and look at ourselves, look at our collective psyche, look at our behaviors, look at our relationships to think about how we can even approach resolving some of these big crises that we're facing. And I think that Waldorf education actually plays a really unique and significant role in this bigger conversation and in thinking about the metacrisis, in part because it's important to understand actually that the origins of Waldorf education are actually rooted in an understanding of the very deep systemic problems of the modern world, right? The Waldorf education came out of a modern world context after the First World War, after industrialization. Rudolf Steiner already seeing really some of the deep material, psychological, and spiritual problems that were coming up for modern people in the modern world. And the root intention of Waldorf education is to create an environment that is healthy for humans in the modern world. And part of that involves reintegrating the past, not losing our connection to the planet and to the earth and farming, creating a community that's very much like the way human communities have been in the past. So as we as a species go through this rupture into the modern world, how are we actually saving and healing and reintegrating that which is quintessentially human about who we are? So I think it's important to know that that is the root intention of Waldorf education, and it's in many ways more relevant now than it was 100 years ago, because a lot of those problems that were just coming up as sprouts, right, in the 20th century are now fully grown forests of really complex interlocked crises that we have to somehow find our way through. So that's our context, and I feel like that's our collective intention, and that's our collective purpose as people who are parents, who are educators, who are in a Waldorf community, who are trying to figure out what the heck is going on in the world. We're trying to prepare our children for that world, and we're also trying to help them become servants of that world and healers of that world. And this book that we're going to focus on tonight, Stolen Focus, is actually just one of many books that we read over the summer as a staff. And it's really, I think it's important to note because really the collection of books that we read collectively really touch different aspects of this metacrisis. There are books about politics and polarization, books about the history of gender and gender nonconformity, books about the metacrisis from an indigenous perspective, books about problems with social media and technology. And one of the books that we read is called Sand Talk, which looks at the metacrisis from an indigenous perspective. And one of the points that's made there is that we are the custodial species of this planet, right? And like, how do humans sort of take their place as custodians of this planet, and how the quality of our thinking, the quality of our interaction, the quality of our collaboration is going to be what determines ultimately the fate of the planet. And all of this depends on the quality of our attention, right? And I feel like Stolen Focus is a really important book because it's bringing together a lot of different research, and it's touching on a lot of different aspects, actually, of what I'm referring to as the metacrisis. But it really homes in on what is a really sort of root cause of the problem and also a potential solution of the problem, which is how we as people control and relate to our own minds, our own attention, and the way that our behavior reflects the quality of our attention. So I'm going to go through the book tonight, and it's a pretty straightforward presentation in the sense that he names 12 causes of what he's really talking about as a crisis of attention. So I'm going to go through those 12 causes, pretty straightforward. So I'll spend more time on some than others, and then we'll open up some space for conversation. So Stolen Focus is a book that talks about how our collective ability to pay attention is rapidly shrinking. And he's really pointing to what he's framing as a sort of overall degradation of our quality of attention as a species, right? Which is a really sort of big and significant claim to make. He refers to our culture as an attentional pathogenic culture, right? A pathogen being an organism that is causing a disease for its host, right? There's something about our environment that's actually like a pathogen or a pathology or a disease, and we have to see how it's affecting us and how to heal ourselves. He claims that people who can't focus will be more drawn to simplistic authoritarian solutions as well. And this is another big theme that we can see of many of the things that are happening in the world today. One of our questions that we have to answer is, how do we keep ourselves from just going along, right? Being led along with whatever the trends are, whatever the status quo is, unconsciously, right? We have to find a way to actually wake up by reclaiming our attention and our agency if we're going to face the root causes of the metacrisis. So the book presents a pretty impressive collection of research. Basically, for each cause, it's sort of, each chapter looks at a cause, and then he's bringing together lots of different sources and citing lots of different experts. He actually sort of is telling his journey of researching these topics throughout the book and really going to visit experts and having interviews and conversations with them. So you really get a window into this journey that he took on. I'm just going to kind of move through these really quickly so that we have them as a frame, and then we can see where are the places where we want to go deeper together. So the first cause that he names is an increase in speed. And the increase in speed comes along with also an increase in the volume of information that we're exposed to, right? Just the fact that we are exposed to so much makes it feel like everything's moving faster, right? And that's just a really key thing to see about our environment right now. It feels like the world is speeding up, and in that we're sacrificing depth, and we're also suffering a cost of what he calls task switching. So the way that we're always going from one thing to the next, and the switch cost effect is something that's talked about in the research of when you're constantly switching tasks. There is a cost to that to you psychologically and emotionally and physiologically. So in this chapter, he talks about technological distraction, creativity drain, diminished memory effect, and how there's really a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of distraction, right? So just painting this picture of how we're all overloaded, we're inundated, we're losing depth, we're moving too fast, and there's a sense of overwhelm with that. There's a good book I don't think he mentions, but it's called In Praise of Slowness. I think the author's Carl Honore. But it's just really this chapter in this book is really in some ways itself in praise of slowness, right? It's trying to make the argument we have to find a way to slow down. And for those of us working in schools, it's an important thing to affirm that there should be a natural pace of life that's reflected in educational environments, right? And I think that's something that we actually do really well. We actually work hard to not be overwhelmed and inundated and always go, 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 but actually being in touch with the rhythms of the day, rhythms of the seasons, rhythms of the year, right? That there's a certain groundedness that comes with a certain pace of being in the world. So this is just one key point that we have to take away. The second cause he talks about is an inhibition or crippling of flow states. So in this chapter, he's digging into the research around flow and what a flow state is, how important it is to have flow states, what allows them. In general, you need to have a goal, a singular task that is meaningful, and to be at the edge of your ability, right? So these are the things that we have to bring together. And again, a school should be an environment that cultivates and facilitates flow states for children and adults. That's kind of one way to frame a healthy school. Making the point, of course, that screen time is anti-flow. You are not in a flow state when you are tuned in to a screen. And we also need to cease distractions, but not replace them with just anything. But we really need to be more conscious about when we're not on screens, are we also doing things where we're actively cultivating flow states? So good examples of things that enable flow states are working on art, being in nature, free play, and reading. So he talks about the difference between deep attention and shallow attention. And in this chapter, he also talks a bit about narcissism and how narcissism itself can be seen as a corruption of attention. And he talks about the difference between when you have healthy attention for something like a person or an event or a group or a story, you're actually, you're giving your attention to that experience and that thing, and there's a sort of there's a release in that, there's an opening in that. Versus if your attention is sucked into something like social media, it's actually perpetually reflected back to you, and it's sort of still about you, like you're actually being attracted to pay attention to yourself online, and it's just a fundamentally different thing. It's not sort of self-emptying into the experience of awareness or attention, but it's actually always recycling and refracting and reflecting your attention back on thinking about yourself and how you're showing up online and how people are perceiving you. So you get a sense of how different that is, and I think he does a good job of explaining that in the book. The third cause is physical and mental exhaustion, right? And here there's a lot of research on sleep and the importance of sleep and how prevalent sleep deprivation is. One key takeaway here is thinking about the importance of dreams and REM sleep and how the best time for that typically is after 7 or 8 hours of sleep. You might notice when you do sleep for 7 or 8 hours, you're dreaming right before you wake up, often because the best time for REM sleep is in that 7th or 8th hour, which means if you don't get 7 or 8 hours of sleep, you're often not even ever getting to that part in your sleep cycle. And on this point, he asks a provocative question. He says, what does it mean to be a society and culture so frantic that we don't have time to dream? And meaning that quite literally in this context. He also mentions how we're exposed to 10 times the artificial light than we were 50 years ago, and again, just kind of unpacks a lot of research on that and the negative effects of that. He also points to this underlying theme, which is how there's a gap between what we know we should do and what we feel like we can do, right? Like I'm not surprising anyone right now by saying that you should get a lot of sleep. Sleep is good for you, REM is good for you, sleep deprivation bad, sleep good, artificial light bad, natural light good. We all know this, and yet we just still keep living in these unhealthy ways. And that's sort of the underlying crux of this whole book, is like we can take in a lot of this research, but ultimately how do we actually reclaim how we're living? And I don't ultimately know the answer to that, but I think it does have something to do with attention, right? It has to do with actually moment to moment. How do you reclaim your own mind and your own agency through cultivating how you're using your own attention? It's sort of one of the underlying messages of the book that comes through here. The fourth cause he talks about is very dear to my heart. He has a whole chapter about the collapse of sustained reading. And I'm someone who believes really strongly that it's actually really important and good to do a lot of reading. And yet we've seen that the percent of people who have never read a book in the past year has tripled from 1978 to 2014. Back in the day in 2017, the average American spent 17 minutes reading a book and 5.5 hours a day on their phone. My sense is that those numbers are just getting further and further apart. He also kind of loops back to the idea of flow and really emphasizes that reading is actually the simplest and most natural way to enter a flow state. If you're totally locked in and you're absorbed in a text, you are actually cultivating a flow state, which has not only the benefits of the text itself, but what's going on for you neurologically and physiologically by being in that state. Another sort of choice quote here, he asks the question, what happens when the deepest layer of thinking becomes available to fewer and fewer people until it is a small minority interest, like opera, right? So, and referring to reading, like what does it mean to be in a culture where the number of people who read just gets fewer and fewer and fewer? So it's this like fringe thing that like some people do off on the side there. It's maybe that's the world that's being created right now, but it doesn't sound like one that is best for us as humans. There's also a good play here on how the medium is the message, and if we also look just sort of implicitly at the kind of messages our children are receiving, when we think about like what are screens saying to our children, right? He talks about screens say the world is fast, right? Screens say life is about surfaces and appearances. Screens say that what matters is how I look, right? Whereas what do books say? Books say life is complex, right? Books say if you want to understand, you have to slow down. Books say there's value in focusing on one thing. Books say it's worthwhile to know about other people and how other people live and think. And there's a whole summary of the research that talks about how the people who read the most, especially fiction in this case, which leaves me out, people who read a lot of fiction actually cultivate more empathy and just have better understanding of other people in general. It also makes the point there's a key difference between storybooks and TV shows, right? We can't just reduce what's happening between the difference between hearing storybooks and reading stories with your parent, for instance, versus sitting down and watching a television show. Like qualitatively, it's not, even if it's the same story and the same content, it's just a fundamentally different experience, physiologically, neurologically, and in terms of the overall experience of the child. Okay, the fifth cause is the disruption of mind wandering. And this is sort of a surprising one, maybe perhaps. We often think of mind wandering as a bad thing, but he actually makes a really strong argument for the importance of having downtime to just let your mind wander. And there's tons of beautiful examples of people who've had epiphanies, just letting their mind wander. There's lots of our most brilliant and famous people really swear by the need to really have that downtime and that sort of dreamy, floaty, mind-wandering time when things can kind of break through. So we need these ebbs and these flows and these rhythms to our lives. And he makes a distinction between mind-wandering and rumination, right? There's a way in which you can ruminate on something if you're stressed, and that's not healthy. That's not what he's referring to. But the problem, the sort of bigger problem that's being pointed to, is that we're often in our culture, we're not focused or mind-wandering, right? We're not in flow, concentrated on something, nor are we sort of free and relaxed and just taking a walk in the park and mind-wandering. We're skimming and task-shifting all the time. So we're not getting the benefits of either practice. Like you need a rhythm between focused time when you're doing something important to you and purposeful when you can be in a flow state and actually have that experience. And then you also need downtime when you're just relaxed and your mind's just wandering and doing whatever. And we've somehow created an environment where we're never really fully getting either of those benefits. So it's sort of an interesting contrast to make. All right, the sixth cause is the fact that technology can manipulate you. And here he's referring to surveillance capitalism. There's a really thick, dense book called Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. I can't necessarily recommend it because it's quite an undertaking, but it will tell you more than you ever need to know about the algorithmic manipulations of big tech and how they're steering so much of the energy that's driving the metacrisis, right? And what this really comes down to is the financialization of technology and social media and how we've created entire sort of media infrastructures that are oriented towards selling advertising. And ad-based incentives are incentivized to capture your attention. So our entire media ecology is basically oriented around capturing as much attention as possible. That's how all the algorithms that run the software of our media ecology are oriented to maximize capturing your attention. This leads to things like negativity bias, because if it's enraging, it's engaging. So much of what we're exposed to is actually to draw us in, and that leads to more negative things being in the media, and where algorithms are actually radicalizing people and sort of debasing this soil of society, where we're all sort of had this skewed perception of what's happening in reality, because what we're being presented with is filtered through a lens that's the thing that will suck us in the most, which tends towards negativity and polarization. He draws a lot on Tristan Harris, who you might know from The Social Dilemma on Netflix. If you haven't seen that, it's kind of old at this point, I guess, but I still recommend it. It's worth seeing. I'd recommend it. Pretty much everyone 12, 13, and up, I think, should watch it. And Tristan is actually somebody who works pretty closely with a good friend of mine, and he started an organization called the Center for Humane Technology. There's a couple good quotes from Tristan in here, who talks about the collective downgrading of humans and the upgrading of machines. And he asks, how can we solve the world's most urgent problems if we've downgraded our attention spans, downgraded our capacity for complexity and nuance, downgraded our shared truth, and downgraded our beliefs to where we can't construct shared agendas to solve our problems? This is destroying our sense-making at a time when we need it the most. Right? So that kind of gets right at the heart of the point that I was trying to name at the beginning, which is we're sort of seeing this degradation of human capacity right at this time when we're facing more complex and unprecedented challenges than ever before, and we actually need to evolve our capacity in order to actually meet the challenges that we're being faced with. So we have to do something about this. Cause 7 relates closely to this system of technology manipulation that we're in. Cause 7 he named as the rise of cruel optimism. And by cruel optimism, he's talking about the fact that if we don't understand the systems that we're embedded in, if we don't understand surveillance capitalism, then we put all the pressure on the individual. And it's a sort of cruel optimism, thinking like, oh, well, all you need to do is, get your apps off your phone and decrease your screen time and you'll be fine. But it's this sort of framing complex systemic problems with simple individualistic solutions, right? He's also critical of that. Because individuals blame themselves when problems have bigger causes that none of us can fix directly through our behavior. So it's sort of a tricky thing to get out of. But just like diet books are not going to solve the problem of obesity, right? Tech diet books are not going to solve ultimately the problem of surveillance capitalism. So we have to really hold both, and it's a hard balance to hold, but ultimately I think it's about sort of finding that balance between individual responsibility and collective action. And in the book, he's actually making the call for collective action. He's really trying to hold that balance. It's not just about read the research, have a better understanding of what you do, control your own agency and attention, and everything will be fine. He's saying do all of that because that's really important, but also we have to do something about these systems that we're embedded in. And we really have to hold both of those things. Cause 8 is a surge in stress. Don't need to say a lot about this. We're probably all feeling it for ourselves, but there's a lot of research on it. If you're interested, a couple key points are just that you have to feel safe in order to pay attention. So it's not really helpful to tell people how much they should pay attention if they're missing sort of the basics, right? If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or if you just think about economic insecurity for people, apparently, one stat is 6 out of 10 people or families have less than $500 in their savings account. So it's just, we have to do something about the collective well-being of our civilization if we expect people to sort of cultivate their own minds and attention. Causes 9 and 10 he puts together, which are about diet and pollution. Again, I won't say too much about health or climate. One of the books that we also read as a staff over the summer was specifically about climate. It's called Climate, A New Story by Charles Eisenstein, which people who read it really loved, and I'd recommend it. It's sort of uplifting and taking a more holistic spiritual approach to understanding the climate emergency. Another one I don't know if I can so much recommend it because it's a real downer, but if you want a sort of updated, like an up-to-date, really pretty thorough look at the situation that we're in, there's a book called Breaking Together by Jem Bendell. That's one that comes to mind if you sort of are interested in the climate issue and the pollution issue. Here, the focus is really on pollution and toxicity and how we're all surrounded by toxic chemicals and bad things in our environment. and how that relates to our diet. So he puts those two things together. And he does basically say if there is a magic bullet, if there's one thing to focus on in that big complex problem, it's probably whole foods, right? It's probably just getting back to a simple sort of, quasi-indigenous whole food, organic food diet, trying to get as many pollutants and chemicals and toxins out of our food as possible and just eating real food that comes from the healthiest patch of earth that you can find. It's actually pretty simple, and people here in this community already know this, and we're doing so many good things around here on that front, which is a big part of the reason why I'm here, and probably many of you are here. Cause 11, he talks about ADHD. So again, a big topic in itself. But apparently from the data that he shared, 13% of adolescents are now diagnosed with ADHD, so more than 1 out of 10. That number has since increased, I think. Children on stimulants has doubled, and that's just between like the late 90s and 2004. So that again has only continued to increase. So, and this is it's a tricky topic and chapter where he really goes into people who disagree with each other, because it's a really complicated conversation about understanding the ADHD phenomenon. So he acknowledges throughout that there are people who think this and people who think that. But the basic tension is between whether we put emphasis on context and environment or whether we put it on neurology and genes, right? And there's disagreement about that. Some people put more emphasis on neurology and genes. Some put more on it has to be environmental. He comes to the conclusion for himself that he seems to think that context and environment are more important than neurology and genes. He also really critiques the sort of big pharma drug aspect of it, of how there's just a really insane amount of medicalization of our children, and how the diagnosis and the treatment through medication, it doesn't really tell you what's happening or why it's happening, and that drug effectiveness is not itself proof of a condition, because the drugs are going to have an impact on anyone for a period of time, and how long-term there's diminishing returns on the effectiveness of medication, and then it leads to its own problems. So overall, trying to look objectively at the research as he does, it seems to be a pretty thoughtful critique of sort of the pharmaceutical approach, not saying that that's not good for everyone, but it is just something that collectively we need to think about and look at what's happening and look at the data and look at the numbers and think about especially how is our environment contributing to this, which in a way is empowering. If you think it's all about your neurology and genes, that's a little bit disempowering. You feel like there's nothing you can do about it. But his take is that no, actually it seems to have a big impact of what people's environments are. Therefore, we should be more thoughtful about how we cultivate them. And the last cause he talks about is a decrease in free play and the confinement of children. And this is one that I could go on and on about. As a former early childhood educator, I've been trying to tell parents for 20 years, pretty much since I was a kid, that kids should have free play. I was probably saying it when I was a kid too. But overall, we're really seeing that schools overall have decreased play, increased tests, increased stress and anxiety, decreased that sort of connection of intrinsic motivation and the benefits of free play, which have to do with creativity and imagination and social connections and just aliveness and a sense of joy and just enjoying your life and your school days, come to think of it. So I have to say again here, this is a sense where you get this picture of sort of what's happening in the world, and it's really affirming for me to feel like, we are blessed to be in an environment where we really are going against this trend, right? And we really see and acknowledge the importance of free play here, especially in early childhood. And I think it's another real key attractor for what's sort of bringing people to a Waldorf school and this kind of sort of more conscious community. So just to kind of remind you what the 12 causes are so that they're in your head. We have an increase in speed, which is related to an increase in like an overload of information. The crippling or inhibiting of flow states and the importance of flow states. Physical and mental exhaustion and lack of sleep. Collapse of sustained reading. Disruption of mind wandering, having downtime to really do nothing and be chill is actually important. Technology that can manipulate you, aka surveillance capitalism or techno-feudalism. The rise of cruel optimism, so taking this complex situation and putting it all on individuals, like, oh, well, you should just do better. That's not really a solution in itself, and it becomes part of the problem. Surge in stress, unhealthy diets related to pollution, the rise of ADHD, and a decrease in free play. So this is the overall situation that we're in. So we can't say we don't know what the problems are, right? So now we are liberated to focus our attention on being the solutions, right? And that's I mean, what else can we do? We have to try. Here we are together, aware of so much, thinking about so much, taking in so much, caring so much about our kids, right? We've got to try. So I think it begins with paying attention to what we're doing. I think it begins with being in community and having meaningful conversations. So our thought coming into this was not just to have me lecture at you for who knows how long, but to actually let's take some time so we can sort of process together in small groups and have some conversations.